I guess what I'd like to do is start out with, a lot of people ask me why I decided to write this book in the first place, and why I decided that I wanted to tackle the whole issue of Canada in a globalizing world. As it has been mentioned, I spent about a decade in Latin America as a foreign correspondent. And as many of you probably know, when you leave your country and come back to it, you leave with a lot of ingrained assumptions and a lot of mythologies that you've grown up with about how you think your country is and how it works and how it operates and how it behaves. And of course, when you aren't able to put your country in a global context and compare it to the way other countries behave and the kind of attitudes that they have. And of course, this can often lead to a very misleading idea and a rather kind of distorted and disingenuous concept of your country and what it's really like. You know, when I left Canada, I thought we were doing all right. In fact, I thought we were better than most, definitely better than Americans, that we were the envy of the world, that everybody wanted to live here and everybody liked us. And then I left. And slowly over time, the pieces of this puzzle didn't quite add up. As a business journalist, I was writing about free trade, and I was writing about how multinationals were piling into Latin America as these countries were liberalizing their economies. And there was obviously a pattern emerging of how markets were developing around the world. And I slowly began to realize that we really weren't a player in this game. And I was particularly struck by this when I was in Mexico, because after having lived in Chile and Argentina, which I thought was, you know, kind of like the end of the earth, you get back to Mexico, and I'm back in North America. We're signatory to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I have to say, I felt like Canada was farther away than it had ever felt. It was completely eclipsed by the U.S. presence there. I wrote about U.S. phone companies that were buying into the newly deregulated Mexican market. I wrote about the massive push by the likes of Citibank and HSBC and the Spaniards into the banking sector at a time where, while Scotia, yes, was there, Bank of Montreal was actually pulling out. And I would go up to the border to write about Japanese and Italian electronics and car parts manufacturers who were investing in assembly for export factories. But I couldn't quite figure out why it was that we weren't really there. And I didn't start really putting the pieces of the puzzle together till I came back to Canada in 2002. And I mean, coming back was, as for anybody who does, I think it can be quite a shock. And I felt like I'd gone from being in the middle of a stampede to being in this kind of hermetically sealed package where the buzz about global markets and these dramatic changes that were being wrought around the world had somehow been just switched off. We weren't hearing about them. We weren't participating in it. We weren't actively engaged in what was happening around the world. And of course, this disengagement and this insularity, this inwardness that I felt when I came back, didn't really stack up with the image that had been carefully honed and we'd been taught, which was we are a trading nation. I'm sure everybody knows. Suppose we are the world's 8th largest trader. We enjoy the world's largest trading relationship in the world. Something like 80% of our GDP relies on trade, and yet we have very little global presence. And when you go out internationally, our companies are invisible. So I thought it was kind of critical to get a handle on why this was, because the world, was and is and will continue to dramatically change, and we seem to be blissfully unaware of this. Now, and I guess the more I looked into it, the more surprised I became about kind of as little by little my preconceived notions about how things work and how things operate in this country, I realized many of them are very illusory. and maybe I'm naive, but people who have read the book have told me that they're equally surprised by the things that I have found. So I think a lot of us are perhaps under these same kind of illusions. And I think Mexico, going back to Mexico, is a case in point, because in that case I found that Canadians, for example, had huge opportunities to buy up assets in that country as it began liberalizing its economy and selling off, privatizing its state-owned enterprises. And the Mexicans actually went out of their way to court Canadians because they saw us as kind of the ideal people to sell to. We aren't big, we aren't threatening, we're not Americans, and we weren't one of the small clutch of powerful Mexican families who control most of the economy down there. So, they offered us, they would say, price is not an object. Are you interested in this mine? But time and time again, the Canadians passed up on these opportunities, and they walked away from steelworks and banks and mines. We have no problem lying on the beach in Cancun, but when it comes to doing business in a foreign country, we seem to shy away from that. And one DFATE official who I interviewed the book, he probably put the dilemma rather well in this rather delicate way. He said to me, how do we get Canadian companies engaged in Mexico and not get diarrhea? That was his job description, basically, to me. Now, of course, this is not an image that normally stacks up with what you consider to be a trading nation. And the simple reason is, as I grew to understand over time, is because we're not a trading nation. The record was actually set straight for me by a European businessman who I interviewed the book, who said to me, Canada is the most comfortable country on earth. You are nice people, but you are not a trading nation. Because a trading nation goes out and cultivates trade, opens new markets, and prices its own product. There's a difference between being a trading nation and a trade-reliant economy. And what we are is the latter. You just have to look at what we trade and with whom. To begin with, we essentially trade with one country, which is the United States. And as for the rest of the world, with the exceptions of a few obscure countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we have a trade deficit with every other country in the world.